Welcome to Marple Parlor. I'm Maddox Hale. Settle in with a cup of tea for a classic Agatha Christie-style mystery, set in the shadowy elegance of 1920s Ravenbrook Hall. This is a tale of deception, locked rooms, and Miss Marple's keen mind unraveling a deadly puzzle. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Let's dive into the mystery. Chapter 1. Introduction and Setup. The autumn mist draped Ravenbrook Hall like a velvet shroud, softening the edges of its ivy-clad towers and mullioned windows. Nestled in the rolling hills of Kent, 1920s England, the estate exuded the quiet grandeur of old money, its stone walls whispering secrets of generations past. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and wood smoke, as Miss Jane Marple stepped from the chauffeured car onto the gravel drive. Her slight frame, wrapped in a sensible tweed coat, belied the sharp mind that had solved many a village mystery in St. Mary Mead. She adjusted her hat, her bird-like eyes taking in the scene with quiet curiosity. Miss Marple had been invited by her old friend, Lady Beatrice Langley, the formidable matriarch of Ravenbrook Hall, to attend a weekend gathering celebrating the engagement of Beatrice's nephew, Captain Roger Langley, to Miss Clara Worthing, a young heiress whose charm and fortune were the talk of London society. The invitation, penned in Beatrice's elegant hand, had hinted at delicate matters requiring Miss Marple's discreet insight, though no specifics were given. One never knows what lies beneath the surface of such gatherings, Miss Marple mused, her knitting bag swinging gently at her side as she ascended the stone steps to the grand oak doors. The butler, Mr. Grayson, a man with the stiff posture of long service, greeted her with a bow and led her into the cavernous hall. Polished marble floors gleamed under chandeliers, and portraits of stern-faced Langleys stared down from the walls. The air was warm with the crackle of a fire, and the faint clink of crystal glasses echoed from the drawing room. Miss Marple's arrival was met with a flurry of introductions, each guest revealing a glimpse of the tension simmering beneath the polished surface. The guest list was small but carefully curated, each person a thread in the intricate tapestry of Ravenbrook's drama. Captain Roger Langley, 32, a decorated war hero with a disarming smile and a reputation for charm. His tailored suit couldn't hide the faint strain in his eyes, and whispers of gambling debts followed him like a shadow. Miss Clara Worthing, 25, the radiant fiancée, her auburn hair catching the firelight as she spoke of poetry with a passion that seemed to mask a deeper unease. Her fortune, inherited from a shipping magnate father, was said to rival the Langley estate itself. Dr. Ernest Pritchard, 45, the family physician, a reserved man with a lean face and a habit of adjusting his spectacles when questioned. His quiet demeanor hinted at a past he preferred to keep buried. Mrs. Lavinia Gray, 38, Beatrice's widowed cousin, whose sharp tongue and penchant for dramatic gestures barely concealed her precarious financial state. Her emerald brooch gleamed with a defiance that spoke of pride. Mr. Victor Henshaw, 50, the Langley family solicitor, a nervous man with thinning hair and a habit of clutching his pocket watch. His eyes darted about as if calculating the cost of every word spoken. Inspector Charles Mallory, 42, a Scotland Yard detective invited under the pretext of advising on security for Clara's heirloom jewels. His broad shoulders and piercing gaze suggested a man accustomed to uncovering truths others wished to hide. Lady Beatrice, resplendent in a burgundy gown, welcomed Miss Marple with a warmth that contrasted her steely demeanor. Over tea in the drawing room, Beatrice explained the occasion. The engagement ball, set for the following evening, would feature the display of the Langley star, a sapphire of breathtaking clarity locked in the library's safe. "A family treasure," Beatrice said, her voice tinged with pride, "and Clara's jewels will join it for the celebration." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking rhythmically as she observed the room. Roger's laughter rang out. but it was too loud, too forced, as he recounted a war story to Victor, who nodded absently, his fingers twisting the watch chain. Clara sat near the window, her delicate hands smoothing her dress as she glanced at Dr. Pritchard, who was engrossed in a medical journal. The glance was fleeting, but Miss Marple caught it, filing it away like a stitch in her knitting. Lavinia, meanwhile, launched into a tirade about the cost of maintaining estates, her words pointedly aimed at Beatrice, who deflected with a tight smile. Inspector Mallory, standing by the fireplace, asked probing questions about the Sapphire's security, his tone suggesting more than professional interest. "A fine piece like that," he said, "attracts all sorts of attention." Dinner was a lavish affair, with silver gleaming under candlelight and conversation dancing around polite topics. Yet Miss Marple noted the undercurrents. Roger's hand trembled slightly as he poured wine. Clara avoided his gaze, and Victor excused himself twice to check papers. Lavinia's barbed remark about Clara's fortune, "Such wealth must be a burden, my dear," drew a flush to Clara's cheeks. Dr. Pritchard remained silent, though his eyes followed every exchange. Mallory, seated beside Beatrice, steered the conversation to the library's security, noting its heavy oak doors and the safe's modern lock. "Impenetrable," he declared, though his smile didn't reach his eyes. After dinner, the guests retired to the drawing room for brandy and cards. Miss Marple, declining to play, settled into an armchair with her knitting, her ears attuned to the room's rhythm. She overheard Clara whisper to Pritchard about a matter of trust, though the doctor's reply was too low to catch. Roger, losing at cards, laughed off his misfortune, but his knuckles whitened around his glass. Victor, hovering near the door, seemed eager to escape, while Lavinia's laughter grew sharper with each sip of brandy. Mallory, declining cards, excused himself to review the library's arrangements, promising to rejoin them later. As the evening wound down, Beatrice led Miss Marple on a tour of the hall, pausing at the library. The room was a fortress of oak and leather, its high shelves lined with ancient tomes. A massive desk dominated the center, and a small, bolted window overlooked the rose garden. The safe, set into the wall, gleamed with cold precision. "Only I and Victor know the combination," Beatrice said, her voice low. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes lingering on the window's bolt, its brass surface catching the lamplight. She noted the room's isolation, its thick walls muffling the sounds of the house. Back in her room, Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting idle as she reflected. The guests were a puzzle, each piece hiding a motive or a secret. Roger's debts, Clara's unease, Pritchard's reticence, Lavinia's desperation, Victor's nerves, and Mallory's scrutiny, all were threads in a tapestry yet to be woven. Beatrice's delicate matters hinted at something deeper, perhaps tied to the sapphire or the engagement itself. "People are much the same," Miss Marple murmured, "whether in St. Mary Mead or Ravenbrook Hall." As she prepared for bed, the house settled into an uneasy silence, broken only by the distant creak of a floorboard. Miss Marple's mind, however, was far from restful, already tracing the patterns of human nature that would soon unravel into tragedy. Chapter 2. The Crime Discovered. The morning sun struggled through the heavy mist enveloping Ravenbrook Hall, casting a pale glow over the Kent countryside. The estate, with its ivy-clad towers and ancient stone, seemed to hold its breath, as if sensing the calamity about to unfold. Inside, the household stirred slowly, the clatter of breakfast preparations mingling with the soft tread of servants. Miss Jane Marple, already awake, was adjusting her shawl in her guest room when a piercing scream shattered the morning's calm. It came from the direction of the library, a sound raw with terror that sent a shiver through even her composed demeanor. Miss Marple stepped into the corridor, her sensible shoes tapping lightly on the polished floor. Other doors opened and sleepy, anxious faces appeared. Captain Roger Langley in a hastily tied dressing gown, Mrs. Lavinia Gray clutching a silk robe, and Dr. Ernest Pritchard, his spectacles slightly askew. The scream had come from Miss Clara Worthing, who now stood trembling outside the library's heavy oak doors, her face as white as the lace collar of her nightdress. It's Inspector Mallory," she stammered, her voice breaking. Oh, it's dreadful." Lady Beatrice Langley, summoned by the commotion, strode down the hall with the butler, Mr. Grayson, at her side. Her burgundy dressing gown billowed like a storm cloud, but her expression was steely. "What is this nonsense, Clara?" she demanded, though her voice faltered as she saw the girl's distress. Roger, pushing past, tried the library door, finding it locked. "Mallory was in there last night," he said, his voice tight. "Said he wanted to check the safe." Grayson, his face pale but composed, produced a master key, but it failed to turn. The door was bolted from the inside. "We'll have to break it down," Roger declared, his military bearing surfacing. With Grayson's help, they shouldered the heavy oak, the wood groaning before splintering at the lock. The door swung open, revealing a scene that silenced the gathered party. Inspector Charles Mallory lay slumped over the mahogany desk, his broad shoulders hunched in an unnatural stillness. A silver letter opener, part of the desk's ornate set, protruded from his back, its handle catching the dim light filtering through the library's bolted window. Blood had pooled beneath him, staining the blotter and a scattering of papers. The safe in the wall stood open, its steel door ajar, and the velvet case that had held the Langley Star sapphire was conspicuously absent. The room was otherwise untouched, no overturned chairs, no signs of a struggle, only the oppressive silence of death. Miss Marple, slipping into the room behind Beatrice, took in the scene with her sharp, bird-like eyes. The library was a fortress of oak paneling and leather-bound books, its high shelves casting long shadows. The single window, small and set high in the wall, was securely bolted, its brass latch gleaming. The only other exit was the door they had just forced, and the key, as Grayson confirmed, was found in Mallory's pocket, clutched in his stiffening hand. "An impossible crime," muttered Constable Dobbs, the local policeman summoned by a breathless footman. His round face was flushed with confusion as he surveyed the locked room. Beatrice, her composure fraying, turned to Miss Marple. "Jane, you've a knack for these things. Until Scotland Yard arrives, will you assist Mr. Dobbs?" Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression mild but her mind already turning. "Of course, Beatrice," she said, her voice as calm as a village stream. She stepped closer to the desk, her gaze sweeping over the details. The half-finished glass of brandy beside Mallory's hand, its amber liquid undisturbed, a torn scrap of paper beneath his fingers bearing the single word "trust" in his precise handwriting, and a faint smudge of wax on the floor near the window, barely noticeable against the polished wood. The guests now gathered in the doorway reacted with a spectrum of emotions. Roger's face was ashen, his hands clenching, as he stared at Mallory's body. Clara, supported by Lavinia, wept silently, her eyes darting to the empty safe. Dr. Pritchard, his clinical detachment evident, knelt to examine the body, confirming death by a single stab wound. "No struggle," he murmured, adjusting his spectacles. "He didn't see it coming." Lavinia, her sharp features taut, clutched her pearls and whispered, "Who could do such a thing?" Victor Henshaw, hovering at the edge of the group, muttered about legal ramifications, his nervous fingers twisting his pocket watch until it slipped to the floor with a clatter. Miss Marple, her knitting bag still slung over her arm, moved carefully around the room. The safe's lock showed no signs of tampering, suggesting the thief knew its combination. The letter opener, she noted, was an unlikely weapon, chosen in haste perhaps rather than premeditation. The window's bolt, though secure, bore a faint scratch as if grazed by a tool. The wax smudge intrigued her most, hinting at a candle used in the dark, though no candle was in sight. She glanced at the high shelves, the heavy curtains, the fireplace cold from disuse. Every detail was a thread in the tapestry of the crime. Constable Dobbs, scratching his head, declared the situation utterly baffling. Locked from the inside, no way in or out, and the sapphire gone, he said, his voice rising. It's like a ghost did it. Miss Marple's lips twitched in a faint smile. Ghosts, Mr. Dobbs, are rarely so precise with a letter opener, she said gently. She turned to Grayson, who stood rigidly by the door. Was the library locked last night after Inspector Mallory entered? Grayson nodded. He insisted on privacy, miss. Said he'd lock himself in to review the security plans. No one went near after that. The household staff, gathered in the hall, confirmed Grayson's account. Elsie, the young maid, her eyes wide with fear, added, I heard nothing, miss, not a sound. The library's walls are thick as a vault. Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing the alibis. The guests, however, were less composed. Roger paced, muttering about the sapphire's value. Clara, her tears drying, seemed to shrink into herself, avoiding Roger's gaze. Pritchard's calm was unnerving, his hands steady as he closed Mallory's eyes. Lavinia's voice rose, accusing the staff of negligence, while Victor suggested an outside thief, though his eyes darted nervously to the bolted window. Miss Marple knelt by the desk, her fingers brushing the torn paper. Trust, she murmured, the word echoing in her mind. Was it a warning, a clue, or a dying man's accusation? She noted the brandy glass, its rim clean but for a faint smear as if wiped. The absence of the sapphire's velvet case puzzled her. Why take the gem but leave the case? She rose, her gaze lingering on the window, its high perch ruling out a casual intruder. The room felt like a puzzle box, its secrets locked as tightly as the door had been. Beatrice, regaining her authority, ordered the staff to secure the house and prepare rooms for the police. This is a scandal, she said, her voice low but fierce. The Langley name will not be tarnished by this. She turned to Miss Marple, her eyes pleading. Jane, find the truth. For all our sakes. Miss Marple met her gaze, her expression serene but resolute. Truth, Beatrice, has a way of revealing itself given time and attention. As Dobbs cordoned off the library, Miss Marple stepped into the hall, where the guests whispered in clusters. Suspicion hung heavy, each glance a potential accusation. Roger's debts, Clara's fortune, Pritchard's past, Lavinia's desperation, Victor's nerves, each was a motive, each a piece of the puzzle. The word trust lingered in Miss Marple's thoughts, a thread she would follow through the labyrinth of Ravenbrook Hall. Chapter 3: Investigation begins. The morning mist had barely lifted from Ravenbrook Hall, its tendrils curling around the estate's ancient towers as if guarding its secrets. Inside, the air was thick with unease, the shock of Inspector Mallory's murder settling over the household like dust. The library, now a crime scene, was sealed by Constable Dobbs, whose earnest but flustered demeanor betrayed his inexperience with such grim affairs. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag at her side, sat in the drawing room, her calm presence a stark contrast to the nervous energy of the gathered guests. Lady Beatrice Langley, her face a mask of resolve, had insisted Miss Marple assist Dobbs until Scotland Yard arrived, and Miss Marple, with her characteristic humility, agreed. It's merely a matter of observing, she said softly, her needles clicking rhythmically, and people do talk so freely over tea. The drawing room, with its velvet drapes and crackling fire, became Miss Marple's impromptu headquarters. The guests, Captain Roger Langley, Miss Clara Worthing, Dr. Ernest Pritchard, Mrs. Lavinia Gray, and Mr. Victor Henshaw, gathered reluctantly, their faces a gallery of grief, fear, and suspicion. Beatrice, presiding over the tea tray, poured with steady hands, though her eyes darted to each guest as if weighing their guilt. Miss Marple, her bird-like gaze missing nothing, began her inquiries with the tact of a village gossip, her questions cloaked in polite concern. She started with Roger, whose military bearing seemed strained, his hands fidgeting with a cigarette case. "Captain Langley, you mentioned being in the billiard room last night. Until what time?" Roger's smile was tight. "Until midnight, I'd say. Victor was with me, weren't you?" Victor, his thin frame hunched, hesitated a fraction too long before nodding. Yes, we played a few rounds. I'm no good at billiards, mind you." His fingers twisted his pocket watch, a nervous tick Miss Marple noted. The pause in his confirmation was a thread to tug later. Clara, her auburn hair pinned haphazardly, sat pale and silent, her teacup trembling in her hands. "Miss Worthing," Miss Marple said gently, "you retired early, I understand." Clara nodded, her voice barely audible. "I was tired. I went to bed by 9. But Elsie, the maid, hovering near the door with a tray, caught Miss Marple's eye and gave a slight shake of her head. Later, in a quiet corner, Elsie confided, "I heard footsteps in Miss Worthing's room after 11, miss. Thought she was pacing, but I couldn't be sure." Miss Marple nodded, filing away the discrepancy. Dr. Pritchard, his spectacles glinting in the firelight, was next. "I visited the library at 10 to borrow a book on botany," he said, his voice precise. "Mallory was alive, working at the desk. I left him there." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And the door was locked when you left?" Pritchard frowned, as if recalling. "He locked it behind me, I believe. Said he wanted privacy." His clinical tone was unshaken, but Miss Marple noted his fingers adjusting his spectacles. A sign of discomfort, perhaps. Lavinia Gray, her emerald brooch flashing with each dramatic gesture, was less composed. "I was asleep by 10, Jane, as I told Mr. Dobbs. This is all too ghastly." Her voice rose, drawing attention, but Miss Marple's gentle probing revealed little more. Lavinia's room, however, was closest to the library, a fact Miss Marple tucked away. Beatrice, observing silently, added, "No one could have passed Lavinia's door without her hearing. Those floors creak terribly." Miss Marple excused herself to re-examine the library, Dobbs trailing behind like an eager puppy. The room remained as they had left it, Mallory's body removed, but the blood-stained blotter untouched, the letter opener now in Dobbs' evidence bag. The safe, its door still ajar, showed no signs of forced entry, confirming the thief knew its combination. Miss Marple knelt by the window, her fingers brushing the faint wax smudge on the floor. "Curious," she murmured, noting its proximity to the bolted window. The bolt itself bore a faint scratch, barely visible, as if grazed by a fine tool. Dobbs, peering over her shoulder, shook his head. "No one could have climbed to that window, miss. It's 20 feet up, no ladder marks outside." She turned to the desk, where the torn paper with "Trust" scrawled in Mallory's hand lay under a glass. The brandy glass, half full, had a faint smear on its rim as if wiped clean. The absence of the sapphire's velvet case nagged at her. Why steal the gem but leave its case? She examined the room's other features, the high shelves, the heavy curtains, the cold fireplace. The oak door, now splintered from being forced, had been locked from within, the key found in Mallory's pocket. "A puzzle box," she said softly, her eyes narrowing. Back in the drawing room, Miss Marple resumed her inquiries, focusing on motives. Roger's gambling debts were no secret. A whispered conversation with Grayson revealed a bookmaker's telegram demanding payment. Clara's fortune, tied to her engagement, made her a target of envy, and her unease around Roger suggested doubts about their future. Dr. Pritchard's reserved nature and vague past raised questions. Had Mallory known something about him? Lavinia's financial troubles, hinted at by her own sharp remarks, suggested desperation. Victor, as the estate's solicitor, had access to the safe's combination, a fact Beatrice confirmed reluctantly. "Only Victor and I know it," she said, her voice tight. Miss Marple's conversation with the staff yielded more threads. Grayson, his loyalty to Beatrice evident, swore no one had approached the library after Mallory entered. Elsie, however, mentioned seeing Lavinia near the library corridor around 10. "Carrying a candle, miss, though she said she was fetching a shawl." The candle intrigued Miss Marple, connecting to the wax smudge. She pressed Elsie gently. "Did you see anyone else?" Elsie hesitated. "Mr. Henshaw was in the hall earlier looking agitated. Said he'd lost his watch." Miss Marple returned to Victor, her tone mild. "Your watch, Mr. Henshaw. When did you last see it?" Victor flushed, patting his pockets. "I must have misplaced it yesterday. It's always slipping out." His nervousness was palpable, and Miss Marple noted it, along with his access to the safe. She then spoke to Clara privately, sensing the girl's fragility. "You seemed troubled last night, my dear," she said kindly. Clara's eyes filled with tears. "Inspector Mallory asked me about my jewels. He said to be careful who I trusted." Her voice broke, and Miss Marple patted her hand, her mind turning over the word trust once more. As the afternoon wore on, Dobbs received a telegram from Scotland Yard, promising Inspector Crane's arrival by evening. The guests grew restless, their alibis fraying under Miss Marple's gentle scrutiny. Roger and Victor's billiard room story wavered when Roger mentioned a specific shot Victor couldn't recall. Clara's late-night footsteps suggested she hadn't been asleep. Pritchard's precise timeline felt too rehearsed, and Lavinia's proximity to the library raised questions. Victor's lost watch, combined with his access to the safe, made him a focal point, though Miss Marple sensed the truth was more tangled. She sat by the fire, her knitting a steady rhythm as she reflected. The locked room, the missing sapphire, the word trust. Each was a piece of a larger pattern. The wax smudge and scratched bolt hinted at a clever mechanism, but the absence of struggle suggested Mallory knew his killer. The guests' motives, debts, secrets, greed, wove a web of suspicion, but Miss Marple knew better than to jump to conclusions. "People are so careless with their words," she thought, her needles clicking, "and their secrets." As the sun dipped below the hills, casting long shadows across Ravenbrook Hall, Miss Marple felt the weight of the mystery settle around her. The truth was there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for her to unravel it. "A matter of trust," she murmured, her eyes glinting with quiet determination. Chapter 4. Clues and Red Herrings. The late morning light filtered weakly through the mist-shrouded windows of Ravenbrook Hall, casting a pallor over the estate that mirrored the unease within. The library, sealed as a crime scene, loomed in the minds of the guests, its locked doors and vanished sapphire a puzzle that gnawed at their nerves. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the drawing-room with her knitting, observed the gathered party with her characteristic calm, her sharp eyes missing nothing. The air was thick with suspicion, each guest casting sidelong glances as Constable Dobbs fumbled through his notes, awaiting Scotland Yard's arrival. Miss Marple, tasked by Lady Beatrice Langley to assist, knew the truth lay in the details, some true, some deliberately misleading. Her inquiries resumed over a fresh pot of tea, poured by Beatrice with a hand that trembled only slightly. Miss Marple began with the staff, seeking threads overlooked in the initial shock of Inspector Mallory's murder. Elsie, the maid, lingered near the door, her eyes darting nervously. "Elsie, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, "you mentioned Mrs. Gray with a candle last night. Did you see anything else unusual?" Elsie hesitated, then whispered, "I found a glove in the rose garden this morning, miss. One of Miss Worthing's, torn at the seam, I left it with Mr. Dobbs. Miss Marple nodded, her mind noting the glove as a potential clue or a planted distraction. Dobbs, overhearing, produced the glove from his evidence bag. A delicate lace piece, unmistakably Clara's, its hem frayed as if caught on a thorn. Clara, her face paling, clutched her teacup. "It's mine, but I didn't lose it. Someone must have taken it from my room." Her voice wavered, and Roger, sitting beside her, gripped her hand, though his own expression was strained. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her thoughts turning. A stolen glove found conveniently near the library suggested a deliberate attempt to shift blame. Her attention shifted to the gardener, Mr. Tate, a grizzled man summoned to recount his morning rounds. "Saw a shadow by the library window last night, miss," he said gruffly. "Around midnight, maybe. Thought it was a trick of the moonlight, but it moved quick-like." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And the ground beneath the window?" Tate shook his head. "No ladder marks, no footprints, just the roses untouched." The absence of physical evidence made the shadow a tantalizing but elusive clue, and Miss Marple wondered if it too was a misdirection. In the library, with Dobbs' reluctant permission, Miss Marple examined the scene again. The wax smudge near the window noted earlier was joined by a new discovery, a single petal from a rare orchid, its vibrant purple stark against the oak floor. The petal, she recalled, matched the blooms in Lavinia Gray's private greenhouse, a hobby Beatrice had mentioned with pride. Miss Marple tucked the petal into her handkerchief, her mind racing. Had Lavinia been in the library? Or was this another planted clue? She re-examined the window's bolt, its faint scratch more pronounced in the daylight. A thin wire, perhaps, could have manipulated it, but the window's height made external access improbable without aid. Back in the drawing room, Miss Marple questioned Lavinia, whose sharp tongue softened under the older woman's gentle gaze. "Mrs. Gray, your greenhouse is quite the treasure," Miss Marple said, her tone conversational. "Those orchids? Are they easily shed?" Lavinia's eyes narrowed. "They're delicate, Jane. A petal could fall, but I wasn't near the library last night." Her denial was firm, but Miss Marple noted a flush in her cheeks. Later, Elsie confided that Lavinia had been seen burning papers in her room's fireplace at dawn. "Old letters," she said, Elsie whispered. But the fire smoked something fierce. Another clue surfaced when Dobbs, rummaging through Mallory's belongings, found a notebook in his room. Tucked inside was a cryptic note. "Beware the shadow in plain sight." The phrase echoed the gardener's sighting, but its vagueness suggested a deeper meaning. Miss Marple, turning the note over in her mind, wondered if it referred to a person rather than a literal shadow. She asked Dobbs to check Mallory's recent cases, and he revealed a telegram from Scotland Yard. Mallory had been investigating a fraud case tied to the Langley estate, though details were sparse. This cast a new light on the motives, particularly for Victor Henshaw, the solicitor whose access to estate finances made him a potential target of Mallory's scrutiny. Miss Marple's conversation with Victor was revealing. "Mr. Henshaw, you mentioned losing your watch," she said, her voice mild. Victor's fingers twitched as if reaching for the absent timepiece. "Yes, yesterday afternoon. I think it's always slipping from my pocket." But Dobbs, with a triumphant air, produced the watch found near the library door, its hands stopped at 11:45 p.m. Victor's face drained of color. "I don't know how it got there," he stammered. "I swear I lost it earlier." The stopped watch, Miss Marple mused, could fix the time of the crime or be another deliberate misstep. The investigation took a new turn when Roger, his temper fraying, confronted Clara about the glove. "If it's yours, Clara, what was it doing in the garden?" His voice was low but sharp, drawing gasps from the others. Clara's eyes filled with tears. "I told you, Roger, it was stolen." "Why?" Don't you believe me?" Her distress seemed genuine, but Miss Marple noted Roger's clenched fists, hinting at deeper doubts about their engagement. Beatrice, intervening, urged calm, but the tension lingered. A final clue emerged from the stables, where a stable boy reported finding a trail of muddy footprints leading from the garden to an empty stall. The prints, however, stopped abruptly, as if the intruder had vanished. Dobbs, excited, declared it evidence of an outsider, but Miss Marple's inspection revealed the prints were too uniform, the mud too neatly applied. "A staged trail," she murmured, her eyes narrowing. The footprints, like the glove, seemed designed to mislead, pointing away from the household. Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting a steady rhythm as she pieced together the clues. The orchid petal linked to Lavinia, but its placement felt too convenient. The shadow by the window, with no physical traces, suggested a ghostly figure, or a clever ruse. Victor's watch, stopped at 11:45, contradicted his alibi, yet its discovery near the library was almost too perfect. The note's warning of a shadow in plain sight hinted at someone trusted, perhaps even liked, within the household. The fraud investigation added a layer of motive, particularly for Victor, whose nervous demeanor grew more pronounced, but also for Lavinia, whose burned papers suggested hidden debts. She questioned Clara privately, sensing the girl's vulnerability. "You spoke with Inspector Mallory about your jewels," Miss Marple said softly. Clara nodded, her voice trembling. "He warned me about trusting too easily. Said someone close might not be what they seem." Her words echoed the note's cryptic message, and Miss Marple's mind turned to the word trust, found under Mallory's hand. Was it a dying accusation, or a clue to the killer's identity? As the afternoon waned, the guests grew restless, their alibis fraying under scrutiny. Roger's billiard room story wavered when Victor couldn't recall details of their game. Clara's stolen glove and late-night footsteps suggested secrets. Pritchard's precise timeline felt rehearsed, and his medical knowledge could conceal a murder's method. Lavinia's burned papers and proximity to the library raised questions, while Victor's watch and access to the safe made him a prime suspect. Yet Miss Marple knew the truth was not in one clue alone, but in their interplay, like stitches in a pattern. The wax smudge and scratched bolt nagged at her, hinting at a mechanism to bypass the locked room. The missing sapphire case, the staged footprints, the planted glove, all pointed to a killer who thrived on misdirection. People are so careless, Miss Marple thought, her needles clicking, but their lies leave traces. As the sun dipped below the Kent hills, casting Ravenbrook Hall in twilight, she felt the mystery tightening, its threads drawing closer to the truth. Chapter 5. Complications and Twists. The afternoon light faded over Ravenbrook Hall, casting long shadows across the Kent estate as the weight of Inspector Mallory's murder pressed heavier on its inhabitants. The air inside was thick with suspicion, the guests' nerves fraying like worn threads under Miss Jane Marple's gentle but relentless scrutiny. The drawing room, once a haven of polished civility, now felt like a stage where each player masked their truths. Miss Marple, her knitting needles clicking softly, sat by the fire, her bird-like eyes observing the subtle shifts in posture and tone that betrayed hidden motives. The clues, Clara's torn glove, Victor's stopped watch, Lavinia's orchid petal, the staged footprints, had woven a complex tapestry, but new revelations were about to unravel its pattern. The first twist came during a tense tea service, overseen by Lady Beatrice Langley, whose composure was beginning to crack. Captain Roger Langley, his face flushed from pacing, confronted Miss Clara Worthing in front of the group. "That glove in the garden, Clara," he said, his voice low but cutting. "How do you explain it? Are you hiding something from me?" Clara's eyes widened, her teacup clattering against its saucer. "I told you, Roger, it was stolen." Why must you accuse me?" Her voice broke and she rose, fleeing to the window, where she stood trembling, her auburn hair catching the dim light. The room fell silent, the accusation hanging like smoke. Miss Marple noted Roger's clenched fists and Clara's defensive posture, sensing a fracture in their engagement that went beyond the murder. Dr. Ernest Pritchard, his clinical calm unshaken, broke the silence. "Enough, Roger," he said sharply, adjusting his spectacles. "Miss Worthing is distraught. Let's not leap to conclusions." But his defense of Clara drew a sharp glance from Roger, and Miss Marple caught a flicker of something deeper. Jealousy, perhaps, or a hidden connection. She recalled Clara's late-night footsteps and her cryptic talk of trust with Mallory. Was Pritchard shielding her, or himself? The investigation took a dramatic turn when Constable Dobbs, rummaging through the library's shelves for overlooked clues, discovered a hidden panel behind a row of dusty tomes. The panel, cleverly disguised in the oak wall, sprang open with a click, revealing a narrow passage barely wide enough for a person. Dust motes danced in the dim light, but faint traces of oil glistened on the hinges, suggesting recent use. "A secret passage!" Dobbs exclaimed, his voice echoing in the quiet library. "This could be how the killer got in." Miss Marple, peering into the cramped space, noted its cobwebbed walls and a faint draft leading to an unknown exit. The passage, she learned from Beatrice, was a relic of the estate's smuggling days, long forgotten by most. Victor Henshaw, visibly shaken, admitted to knowing of it from old estate plans. "But it's been locked for years," he insisted, his voice high. "The key's long lost." Miss Marple's inspection of the passage revealed a rusted lock at its far end leading to the servants' quarters, but no key was found. The oil on the hinges, however, suggested someone had tampered with it recently. This discovery electrified the household, offering a possible solution to the locked room mystery. But Miss Marple cautioned Dobbs against hasty conclusions. "A passage is only as useful as its user," she said softly, her eyes scanning the guests' faces. The passage could implicate Victor with his knowledge of the estate, but its dusty interior suggested it hadn't been used the night of the murder. Was it a genuine clue or another distraction? The tension escalated when Lavinia Gray, her sharp tongue barely restrained, admitted to burning papers in her fireplace. Cornered by Miss Marple's gentle questioning, she flushed, her emerald brooch glinting as she gestured. "They were personal financial records, Jane," she said defensively. "Nothing to do with this ghastly business." But Elsie, the maid, whispered to Miss Marple that the papers included a letter with a London bank seal burned hurriedly at dawn. The orchid petal found in the library tied to Lavinia's greenhouse further clouded her alibi. Miss Marple, her needles pausing, wondered if Lavinia's financial desperation had driven her to more than burning evidence. A new clue surfaced when Dobbs, still combing Mallory's belongings, found a coded ledger tucked inside a hollowed-out book in his room. The ledger, written in Mallory's precise hand, contained cryptic entries. Sums of money, initials, and dates, with VH appearing repeatedly alongside large withdrawals. Miss Marple, examining the ledger, suspected it pointed to Victor Henshaw's involvement in the fraud case Mallory had been investigating. When confronted, Victor's face drained of color. "I handled estate accounts, yes, but nothing improper," he stammered, his fingers clutching at his missing watch. The ledger, combined with his stopped watch found near the library, tightened the net around him, but Miss Marple sensed the truth was not so simple. The most shocking twist came during a private moment in the conservatory, where Dr. Pritchard sought out Clara. Miss Marple, unnoticed behind a fern, overheard their heated exchange. "I told Roger it wasn't true," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. "You mustn't say anything." Pritchard's tone was low, urgent. "I'm protecting you, Clara. If they knew about us..." He trailed off, but the implication was clear. An affair, or the rumor of one, between Clara and Pritchard. Miss Marple's heart sank, not from shock, but from the pattern it revealed. Jealousy, betrayal, and hidden motives weaving through the household. When Clara later denied the affair to Miss Marple, claiming Pritchard was covering for a misunderstanding, her eyes betrayed fear. Was Pritchard's confession a shield for Clara, or a calculated move to deflect suspicion? The arrival of Inspector Crane from Scotland Yard added further complications. A brusque man with a clipped mustache, Crane dismissed Miss Marple's village meddling but grudgingly accepted her presence at Beatrice's insistence. He focused on the passage, declaring it the key to the locked room mystery, and interrogated Victor about his knowledge of it. Victor's denials grew frantic, his nervous demeanor drawing Crane's scrutiny. Miss Marple, however, suspected the passage was a red herring. Its dusty interior and rusted lock suggested it hadn't been used in years, despite the oiled hinges. The true method of entry, she believed, lay in the wax smudge and scratched window bolt, hinting at a subtler trick. Miss Marple's theory took shape. The murder and the sapphire's theft might be separate crimes, linked by opportunity but driven by different motives. The word trust on Mallory's note pointed to betrayal, perhaps by someone he knew well. Victor's ledger entries suggested financial misconduct, but Clara's distress and Pritchard's confession hinted at personal secrets. Lavinia's burned papers and the orchid petals suggested desperation, while Roger's jealousy over Clara cast him as a volatile figure. The staged footprints and planted glove, Miss Marple mused, were the work of a killer who thrived on misdirection, weaving a web to ensnare the unwary. She questioned Roger privately, probing his confrontation with Clara. "You seemed quick to doubt her, Captain Langley," she said gently. Roger's jaw tightened. "That glove, her secrets, it's too much, Miss Marple. I thought I knew her." His anger, tinged with hurt, suggested a man grappling with betrayal. But Miss Marple wondered if his own debts made him a pawn in a larger game. She then spoke to Pritchard, whose calm facade cracked slightly. "I only wanted to protect Clara's reputation," he said, adjusting his spectacles. "There's no affair, just a misunderstanding." His vagueness was telling, and Miss Marple filed it away. As evening fell, the guests gathered for dinner, their forced civility a thin veneer over their fears. Crane's brusque questions only heightened the tension, with Lavinia snapping at his accusations and Victor retreating into silence. Miss Marple, observing from her corner, felt the mystery tightening like a knot. The passage, the ledger, the affair. Each was a twist in the tale, but the truth lay in their interplay. The wax smudge, the scratched bolt, the word trust. These were the threads she would follow, her mind as sharp as her needles. People are so careless with their secrets, she thought, her knitting steady as the firelight danced. Ravenbrook Hall was a house of shadows, but Miss Marple knew the light of truth was near, waiting to be uncovered. Chapter 6. The Revelation. The twilight cast an ethereal glow over Ravenbrook Hall, its ivy-clad towers standing sentinel as the Kent mist thickened. Inside the drawing room was a crucible of tension, the air heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting folded neatly in her lap, stood before the assembled guests. Captain Roger Langley, Miss Clara Worthing, Dr. Ernest Pritchard, Mrs. Lavinia Gray, Mr. Victor Henshaw, and Lady Beatrice Langley. Inspector Crane, the brusque Scotland Yard officer, loomed by the fireplace, his skepticism of Miss Marple's village methods barely concealed. Yet Beatrice's insistence had granted her this moment, and Miss Marple's calm voice, warm and deliberate, cut through the nervous chatter like a needle through silk. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her bird-like eyes scanning each face. "A murder has been committed in this house and the Langley Star sapphire stolen. The library was locked, the window bolted, yet Inspector Mallory lies dead. Let us unravel this puzzle together. Her tone was conversational, almost soothing, but her words carried the weight of inevitability. The guests shifted uneasily, their eyes darting. Roger's hands clenched, Clara's breath hitched, Pritchard adjusted his spectacles, Lavinia clutched her brooch, and Victor's fingers twitched as if seeking his lost watch. Miss Marple began with the locked room, the heart of the mystery. The library's door was bolted from within, the key in Mallory's pocket. The window, high and bolted, seemed impassable. Yet a faint scratch on the bolt and a smudge of wax on the floor tell a different story. She paused, letting the silence press on them. The bolt was tampered with not by force but by a thin wire threaded through a crack in the window frame. A patient, delicate task. The wax came from a candle used to light the work in the dark. No ladder was needed. The wire was manipulated from inside by someone already in the house. Crane scoffed, but Miss Marple continued undeterred. The hidden passage, so dramatically discovered, was a distraction. Its rusted lock and dusty interior prove it wasn't used that night, despite the oiled hinges suggesting recent attention. A clever red herring meant to mislead. She turned to the clues. The torn glove in the garden, the staged footprints to the stables, the stopped watch at 11:45 p.m. These were planted, she said, to point us outward to an imaginary thief, but the truth lies closer. She addressed the sapphire's theft. The safe was unforced, opened by someone who knew the combination. Only Lady Beatrice and Mr. Henshaw had that knowledge. Victor's face paled, but Miss Marple raised a hand. Theft, however, was not the primary crime. Inspector Mallory was murdered and the sapphire taken to obscure the motive. She held up the scrap of paper found under Mallory's hand, the word trust scrawled in his writing. This was his final act, a clue to his killer, a person he trusted who betrayed him. The guest's motives came under her lens. Captain Langley, your gambling debts are substantial, confirmed by a bookmaker's telegram. The sapphire could clear them, but your alibi with Mr. Henshaw holds, albeit shakily. Roger's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Miss Worthing, your glove in the garden and late-night footsteps raised questions, as did your talk of trust with Mallory. Yet your distress seems genuine. Clara's eyes filled with tears, her hands trembling. Dr. Pritchard, your confessed affair with Clara, though denied, suggests a personal motive, and your medical knowledge could stage a clean kill. Pritchard's face remained impassive, his spectacles glinting. Mrs. Gray, your burned papers and the orchid petal from your greenhouse point to financial desperation, perhaps tied to Mallory's fraud investigation. Lavinia's sharp intake of breath was audible. Mr. Henshaw, your stopped watch found near the library and the ledger's entries marked VH suggest you were Mallory's target. Miss Marple's voice softened, her gaze settling on Victor. Mr. Henshaw, you are the shadow in plain sight. A gasp rippled through the room. Victor's hands shook, his voice rising. This is preposterous. I lost my watch and the ledger. Those entries mean nothing. But Miss Marple's calm was unyielding. Inspector Mallory was investigating fraud in the Langley estate's accounts. The ledger's entries, coded but clear, show you siphoned funds to cover personal debts. Mallory confronted you that night in the library, didn't he? She reconstructed the crime. You met Mallory under the pretense of discussing the sapphire's security. He trusted you, his friend and the estate's solicitor. When he accused you of embezzlement, you acted in haste, seizing the letter opener from the desk and striking him from behind. No struggle, no noise. The wound was precise, as Dr. Pritchard confirmed. You then staged the theft, opening the safe with the combination you knew, taking the sapphire to suggest a robbery gone wrong. Miss Marple addressed the locked room. After the murder, you used a wire threaded through the window frame to manipulate the bolt from inside, creating the illusion of an impossible crime. The wax smudge came from your candle used to see in the dark. You left the key in Mallory's pocket, locking the door as you exited, and planted the glove, footprints, and watch to mislead us. She paused, her eyes piercing. The sapphire, I believe, is hidden in your room inside a hollowed-out law book, a place you thought safe. Victor's composure shattered. You have no proof, he shouted, but his voice cracked. Crane, now alert, nodded to his men, who moved to Victor's side. Miss Marple continued, her tone measured. The stopped watch was a mistake. You dropped it in your haste, and its time, 11:45, marks when you were in the library, not playing billiards. The gloves stolen from Clara's room and the footprints smeared with stable mud were your attempts to cast suspicion elsewhere. The orchid petal, likely caught on your shoe from a visit to Mrs. Gray's greenhouse to borrow a tool, was an unintended trace. She turned to the other clues. Miss Worthing's footsteps and talk of trust were personal fears about her engagement, not the murder. Dr. Pritchard's confession was a misguided attempt to protect Clara's reputation, not a guilty act. Mrs. Gray's burned papers were financial records hiding her own troubles, but she was asleep during the crime. The passage, oiled to suggest use, was a final deception, but its dust betrayed its disuse. Crane, grudgingly impressed, ordered a search of Victor's room. Within minutes, a constable returned, holding a hollowed-out law book with the Langley Star sapphire nestled inside. Victor slumped, his face ashen, as Crane's men restrained him. You trusted me, Victor muttered, his voice barely audible. And I trusted no one. Miss Marple's eyes softened, not with pity but understanding. Betrayal, Mr. Henshaw, leaves its own scars, she said quietly. The room was silent, the weight of the revelation settling over them. Beatrice's shoulders sagged, relief mingling with sorrow. Clara clung to Roger, their earlier rift forgotten in the face of truth. Pritchard adjusted his spectacles, his expression unreadable, while Lavinia's hand dropped from her brooch, her defiance spent. Crane, clearing his throat, muttered, Well done, Miss Marple, though I'd have gotten there eventually. Miss Marple returned to her chair. Her knitting resumed as if nothing had occurred. People are much the same, she said softly, almost to herself, whether in St. Mary Mead or Ravenbrook Hall. They hide their fears, but their actions speak. The sapphire gleamed in the firelight, restored but tainted by the blood it had cost. The mystery of the locked room was solved, the killer unmasked. But Miss Marple knew the human heart held shadows no light could fully banish. As the guests dispersed, their whispers trailing into the night, Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, weaving the final stitches of the truth. Ravenbrook Hall, for now, was at peace, but only until the next secret stirred. Chapter 7. Justice Served. The evening shadows stretched long across Ravenbrook Hall, the Kent estate's ancient towers standing silent as the mist thickened outside. Inside, the drawing room was bathed in the warm glow of the fire, but the air carried a chill that no flame could dispel. The revelation of Mr. Victor Henshaw as Inspector Mallory's killer had left the household reeling, the weight of betrayal settling over the guests like a shroud. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly in her armchair, her knitting folded in her lap, her bird-like eyes observing the aftermath with a calm that belied the storm of emotions around her. Lady Beatrice Langley, her composure strained but intact, stood by the window, her burgundy gown a stark contrast to the pale dusk beyond. Inspector Crane, his skepticism of Miss Marple's methods now tempered by her success, prepared to escort Victor to face justice. Victor Henshaw, his nervous demeanor replaced by a hollow resignation, stood flanked by two constables. His thin frame seemed to shrink under the weight of his guilt, his hands no longer reaching for the absent pocket watch that had betrayed him. The Langley Star sapphire, recovered from the hollowed-out law book in his room, gleamed on the table, its clarity a mocking reminder of the blood it had cost. The guests, Captain Roger Langley, Miss Clara Worthing, Dr. Ernest Pritchard, and Mrs. Lavinia Gray, gathered in a loose semicircle, their faces a gallery of relief, sorrow, and lingering suspicion. Miss Marple's voice, warm and deliberate, broke the silence. "Justice, my friends, is a quiet thing," she said, her tone as soothing as a village sermon. "It does not shout, but it finds its way like water through stone." Her words were for all, but her gaze rested on Victor, who avoided her eyes. "Mr. Henshaw, you betrayed a trust, not only Inspector Mallory's but that of this house. Yet the truth, as it always does, has come to light." Crane, clearing his throat, stepped forward. "Henshaw, you'll be taken to London for trial. Embezzlement and murder. There's no escaping the gallows." His brusque tone masked a grudging respect for Miss Marple, who had pieced together the puzzle he'd dismissed as unsolvable. Victor's voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "I never meant for it to come to this," he said, his eyes fixed on the sapphire. "Mallory was too close. I panicked." His confession, though redundant, seemed to unburden him, if only slightly. Miss Marple addressed the room, tying up the final threads. The clues were many, but their purpose was singular: to obscure the truth. The torn glove stolen from Miss Worthing was placed in the garden to suggest an outsider. The muddy footprints to the stables, so carefully staged, led nowhere. The stopped watch, dropped in haste, marked the time of the crime, not an alibi. The orchid petal, caught unwittingly from Mrs. Gray's greenhouse, was a slip, not a plan. Lavinia, her hand at her emerald brooch, exhaled sharply but said nothing. The hidden passage with its oiled hinges was a clever distraction, but its dust revealed its disuse. The true method, the wire through the window frame guided by candlelight, was simple, yet effective. She turned to the word trust, scrawled on the paper found under Mallory's hand. Inspector Mallory's final act was to name his betrayer. He trusted Mr. Henshaw, his friend, who used that trust to gain access to the library and strike when confronted about the embezzlement. The sapphire's theft was a ruse, meant to mask the murder's true motive. She paused, her eyes softening. People are much the same, whether in St. Mary Mead or Ravenbrook Hall. Their fears and follies leave traces no lock can hide. Beatrice, her voice steady but heavy, spoke at last. "This house has seen too much sorrow, Jane. Your clarity has saved us from further scandal." She turned to the sapphire, its brilliance now a burden. "This gem will be locked away, not displayed. Its allure has cost us dearly." Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression one of quiet agreement. "Wealth, Lady Beatrice, often blinds us to what matters most." The aftermath unfolded swiftly. Victor, his wrists bound, made a sudden lunge toward the door, desperation flaring in his eyes. "I won't hang for this," he shouted, but Crane's constables were quick, pinning him against the wall. His struggle was brief, his strength spent, and he sagged as they led him to the waiting police car. The crunch of gravel under tires echoed through the hall as Victor was driven into the night, his fate sealed by his own actions. The guests, left to process the truth, dispersed with varying degrees of relief. Roger and Clara, their engagement strained by mistrust, retreated to the conservatory to talk. Roger's voice, low and earnest, carried to Miss Marple's ears as she passed. "I was wrong to doubt you, Clara," he said, his hand reaching for hers. Clara's reply was soft, hesitant. "We've much to mend, Roger, but I want to try." Miss Marple, pausing unseen, noted the flicker of hope in their clasped hands, though Roger's gambling debts loomed like a shadow. She trusted Clara's strength would guide them, or lead her away if needed. Dr. Pritchard, his clinical facade softened, approached Miss Marple. "I owe you an apology," he said, adjusting his spectacles. My attempt to protect Clara's reputation was foolish. There was no affair, only a moment of weakness, she confided in me. Miss Marple's smile was kind. Your heart was in the right place, Doctor, but secrets rarely protect. Pritchard nodded, his relief palpable, and excused himself to check on the staff, who were shaken by the day's events. Lavinia Gray, her sharp tongue subdued, lingered by the fire. I burned those papers to hide my debts, Jane, she admitted, her voice low. Not murder, but shame. Mallory's investigation frightened me. Miss Marple patted her hand. Shame is a heavy burden, Mrs. Gray, but honesty lightens it. Lavinia's eyes glistened, and she nodded, her defiance giving way to vulnerability. Beatrice, alone with Miss Marple as the others retired, poured a final cup of tea. You've done more than solve a crime, Jane, she said, her voice thick with gratitude. You've preserved this family's honor. Miss Marple shook her head gently. Honor is in truth, Beatrice, not in hiding it. You'll rebuild, as you always have. Beatrice's smile was weary but genuine, a promise of resilience. The next morning, as the mist lifted from Ravenbrook's hills, Miss Marple prepared to depart. Her bags packed, she stood on the gravel drive, her tweed coat buttoned against the chill. The engagement ball, quietly cancelled, left the hall subdued, but the sapphire was secured and the household breathed easier. Crane, overseeing the police's departure, tipped his hat to her. You've a knack, Miss Marple, he said gruffly. Scotland Yard could use you. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. I'm quite content in St. Mary Mead, Inspector. The village has mysteries enough. As the chauffeured car carried her toward the station, Miss Marple gazed at Ravenbrook Hall, its towers fading into the mist. She thought of Victor's betrayal, born of desperation, of Clara and Roger's fragile hope, of Pritchard's misguided loyalty and Lavinia's hidden shame. People are so predictable, she murmured, her needles clicking in her bag, yet each heart holds its own puzzle. The train whistle sounded in the distance, calling her back to her quiet village, where new threads of human nature awaited her keen unraveling. The mystery of Ravenbrook Hall was closed, but Miss Marple knew life's tapestry was never complete. Justice, quiet but relentless, had prevailed, and the truth, as always, had found its way. Chapter 8. Shadows of Truth. The dawn broke gently over Ravenbrook Hall, its mist-wreathed towers bathed in a soft golden light that belied the darkness of the past days. The Kent estate, though still grand, carried a quiet weight, as if the stones themselves mourned Inspector Mallory's murder and the betrayal that had unraveled within its walls. Miss Jane Marple, her tweed coat neatly buttoned, sat in the morning room, her knitting needles idle for once as she sipped tea with Lady Beatrice Langley. The sapphire, safely returned to its vault, gleamed no longer as a prize but as a reminder of human frailty. Victor Henshaw's arrest had lifted a veil, but the household remained unsettled, the guests grappling with truths that cut deeper than the crime itself. Miss Marple's presence, calm and unassuming, was a steadying force. Beatrice, her burgundy shawl draped over her shoulders, looked older in the morning light, her eyes tracing the room's ornate cornices as if seeking answers in their patterns. Jane, she said softly, you've given us clarity, but the wounds remain. How does one heal a house so torn? Miss Marple's smile was gentle, her voice warm and deliberate. Time, Beatrice, and honesty. A house, like a heart, mends when its truths are faced. The other guests, Captain Roger Langley, Miss Clara Worthing, Dr. Ernest Pritchard, and Mrs. Lavinia Gray, were scattered about the estate, each processing the revelation in their own way. Roger and Clara, their engagement strained by mistrust, had spent the night in quiet conversation, their voices drifting from the conservatory. Dr. Pritchard, his clinical reserve softened, had taken to checking on the staff, who were shaken by the upheaval. Lavinia, her sharp tongue dulled, wandered the gardens, her emerald brooch catching the light as she grappled with her exposed financial woes. Inspector Crane, though departed with Victor in custody, had left a constable to tie up loose ends, and the household buzzed with the aftershocks of justice. Miss Marple, ever observant, noted the subtle shifts in the guest's demeanor. She had unraveled the murder, Victor's desperate act driven by Mallory's discovery of his embezzlement. But questions lingered, not about the crime, but about its ripples. The word trust scrawled in Mallory's dying hand had pointed to Victor, but it also echoed through the relationships fractured by suspicion. Miss Marple knew her work was not done. Truth required not just exposure, but understanding, a knitting together of human frailties. She began her morning by visiting Clara, who sat in the rose garden, her auburn hair loose and her eyes red from sleeplessness. "Miss Worthing," Miss Marple said, settling beside her on a stone bench, "you've carried a heavy burden." Clara's hands twisted in her lap, her voice barely audible. "I thought Roger doubted me because of the glove, but it was more. He's afraid of his debts, of losing me." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes kind. "Fear makes us see shadows where there are none. Have you spoken honestly with him?" Clara's gaze met hers, a spark of resolve igniting. "We're trying. He's promised to face his debts, to seek help. But trust, it's fragile." Miss Marple patted her hand. "Trust is rebuilt one truth at a time, my dear." Next, Miss Marple sought Roger, finding him in the billiard room staring at the table where his shaky alibi with Victor had been questioned. His military bearing was softened, his face etched with regret. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low, "I was a fool to accuse Clara. My debts made me see betrayal everywhere." Miss Marple's needles, resumed in her lap, clicked softly. "Captain Langley, a man who faces his flaws is stronger than one who hides them. Clara needs your honesty, not your pride." Roger nodded, his jaw tight. "I've wired my solicitor to settle what I can. I won't lose her to my mistakes." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, sensing a thread of hope in his resolve. Dr. Pritchard, encountered in the hall, offered a rare smile. "Miss Marple, I misjudged you," he said, adjusting his spectacles. "My attempt to shield Clara was clumsy. I thought to spare her scandal, but I only muddied the waters." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "Your heart was kind, Doctor, but truth is the best shield. Miss Worthing's strength will carry her." Pritchard's nod was thoughtful, and he excused himself to assist the housekeeper, who was struggling to restore order among the staff. Lavinia Gray, found in her greenhouse among her orchids, was less forthcoming. The petal found in the library had been a fleeting clue, but her burned papers had revealed her financial ruin. "Jane," she said, her voice sharp but brittle, "I hid my debts to save face. Now the world knows." Miss Marple, examining a vibrant orchid, replied softly, "The world forgets quickly, Mrs. Gray, when you face it with courage. Your greenhouse is a testament to what you can nurture." Lavinia's eyes softened, and she plucked a petal, offering it to Miss Marple. "Perhaps you're right. I'll start anew somehow." Beatrice, joining Miss Marple for luncheon, shared her own reflections. "The sapphire will stay locked away," she said, her voice firm. "It brought nothing but grief. Victor was family in a way, and his betrayal cuts deep." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her gaze steady. "Betrayal wounds, Beatrice, but it also reveals strength. You'll guide this house forward." Beatrice's smile was faint but resolute, a promise to rebuild. The constable, a young man named Harris, approached Miss Marple with a final piece of evidence, a letter found in Victor's room addressed to Mallory but never sent. It was a plea for forgiveness, admitting to minor thefts but denying larger crimes. "I took small sums," it read, "to cover debts, but I meant to repay. You trusted me, Charles, and I failed you." Miss Marple read it silently, her heart heavy. The letter confirmed her theory. Victor's act was born of panic, not premeditation. A desperate lashing out when cornered. She handed it to Harris, who promised to pass it to Crane. As the day wore on, the household began to heal. The staff, under Grayson's steady hand, resumed their duties, though whispers of the murder lingered. Clara and Roger, seen walking arm in arm, spoke of a quieter engagement, one free of the Sapphire's shadow. Pritchard offered his medical services to the village, a gesture of goodwill, while Lavinia began drafting letters to creditors, her defiance replaced by determination. Beatrice, ever the matriarch, planned to restore Ravenbrook's reputation, starting with a charity event in Mallory's memory. Miss Marple, preparing to depart, stood in the grand hall, her bags at her feet. The portraits of stern Langleys seemed less imposing now, their gaze softened by the truth's light. Beatrice clasped her hands, her voice thick with gratitude. "Jane, you've given us more than justice. You've given us a path forward." Miss Marple's smile was modest. "I only followed the threads, Beatrice. People weave their own stories for better or worse." As the car rolled down the gravel drive, Miss Marple gazed at Ravenbrook Hall, its towers fading into the mist. She thought of Victor's downfall, Clara and Roger's fragile hope, Pritchard's redemption, and Lavinia's resolve. "People are so careless with their hearts," she murmured, her needles clicking in her bag. "But they mend, given time." The train to St. Mary Mead awaited, its whistle a call to new mysteries, new threads to unravel. Ravenbrook Hall stood silent, its wounds exposed but healing. Justice had been served, not with fanfare, but with the quiet certainty of truth, a light that no shadow could dim. Chapter 9. The Mending of Hearts. The late morning sun broke through the mist enveloping Ravenbrook Hall, casting a soft, forgiving light over its ivy-clad towers and rolling Kent hills. The estate, though scarred by the recent tragedy of Inspector Mallory's murder, seemed to breathe easier, as if the truth's unveiling had loosened a long-held knot. Miss Jane Marple, her tweed coat neatly folded over her arm, sat in the morning room, her knitting needles resting in their bag as she shared a final pot of tea with Lady Beatrice Langley. The Langley Star sapphire, now locked deep in the estate's vault, no longer sparkled as a prize but stood as a silent witness to human frailty. Victor Henshaw's arrest had closed the case, but the household's wounds, mistrust, shame, and fear required a gentler mending, one Miss Marple knew was her final task before departing. Beatrice, her burgundy shawl draped elegantly, gazed out the window, her eyes tracing the garden's paths where roses bloomed despite the autumn chill. "Jane," she said, her voice softer than Miss Marple had ever heard, "you've given us more than justice. You've shown us our flaws, and somehow that feels like a gift." Miss Marple's smile was warm, her voice deliberate and soothing like a village storyteller's. "Flaws, Beatrice, are but threads in the tapestry. It's how we weave them that matters." The other guests, Captain Roger Langley, Miss Clara Worthing, Dr. Ernest Pritchard, and Mrs. Lavinia Gray, moved through the house with a cautious hope, each grappling with the truths exposed by the murder. Roger and Clara, their engagement tested by suspicion, had spent the previous evening in earnest conversation, their voices low but resolute. Pritchard, his clinical reserve giving way to quiet empathy, had taken to comforting the staff, who were shaken by the betrayal of Victor, a man they'd trusted. Lavinia, her sharp edges softened, wandered her greenhouse, tending orchids as if nurturing her own fragile resolve. The constable left by Inspector Crane, young Harris, was finalizing reports, his presence a reminder that justice, though served, left echoes. Miss Marple began her day with Clara, finding her in the conservatory, surrounded by ferns and the faint scent of earth. Clara's auburn hair was pinned neatly, but her eyes carried the weight of sleepless nights. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice steady but soft, I feared Roger would never trust me again. Not after that glove, not after my doubts. Miss Marple settled beside her, her presence a quiet anchor. Trust is a delicate thing, my dear, but it grows stronger when tended with honesty. Have you and Roger spoken plainly? Clara nodded, a faint smile breaking through. He's admitted his debts, promised to settle them. We're starting anew, slowly. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Slowly is the best way, Clara. A heart mends stitch by stitch. Roger was next, found in the library's anteroom avoiding the sealed crime scene. His military posture was less rigid, his face etched with a vulnerability Miss Marple hadn't seen before. I was wrong to doubt Clara, he said, his voice low. My debts made me see enemies everywhere, even in her. Miss Marple's needles, though idle, seemed to hum with her thoughts. Captain Langley, a man who owns his mistakes is a man who can rebuild. Clara needs your strength, not your pride. Roger's jaw tightened, but his nod was firm. I've contacted a friend in London, someone who can help with the debts. I won't let her down again. Miss Marple's smile was encouraging, sensing a thread of redemption in his resolve. Dr. Pritchard, encountered in the hall, offered a rare confession. Miss Marple, I muddled things with my talk of an affair, he said, adjusting his spectacles with a sheepish air. I thought to shield Clara from gossip, but I only caused pain. Miss Marple's voice was kind. Your instinct was to protect, Doctor, but truth is the best shield. Clara's stronger than you know. Pritchard's relief was palpable, and he mentioned a plan to offer free consultations to the village, a small atonement for his misstep. Miss Marple nodded, approving of his quiet goodwill. Lavinia Gray, in her greenhouse, was surrounded by the vibrant hues of her orchids, her emerald brooch glinting as she pruned a stem. The petal found in the library had been a fleeting clue, but her burned papers had exposed her financial ruin. Jane, she said, her voice less sharp than before, I hid my debts to save my pride. Now it's all laid bare. Miss Marple, examining a delicate bloom, replied softly, Pride is a heavy cloak, Mrs. Gray. Lay it down and you'll find strength in honesty. Lavinia's eyes glistened, and she offered a rare, genuine smile. I've written to my creditors. It's humbling, but I'll rebuild. Miss Marple's nod was approving, a silent acknowledgement of Lavinia's courage. Beatrice, over luncheon, shared her plans for Ravenbrook. The sapphire stays locked away, she said firmly. It's brought nothing but sorrow. I'm planning a memorial for Mallory, a charity event to honor his service. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her gaze warm. A fitting tribute, Beatrice. You've always known how to guide this house through storms. Beatrice's smile was weary but resolute, a testament to her enduring strength. A final piece of the puzzle surfaced when Constable Harris approached Miss Marple with a discovery. A small diary in Mallory's belongings overlooked in the initial search. Its pages detailed his suspicions of Victor's embezzlement, but also a personal note. Victor was a friend once. His greed blinds him, but I pity him. Miss Marple read it silently, her heart heavy with the tragedy of broken trust. The diary confirmed her understanding of Victor's desperation, a man driven to murder not by malice but by fear of exposure. She handed it to Harris, who promised to include it in the case file for Victor's trial. As the afternoon unfolded, the household began to knit itself back together. The staff, under Mr. Grayson's steady guidance, resumed their routines, their whispers of the murder fading into resolve. Clara and Roger, seen strolling the garden, spoke of a simpler future, free of the sapphire's allure. Pritchard's offer to aid the village was met with gratitude, easing the staff's unease. Lavinia, her greenhouse a sanctuary, drafted plans for a small floral business, her pride giving way to purpose. Beatrice, ever the matriarch, coordinated with the village vicar for Mallory's memorial, a step toward healing the estate's reputation. Miss Marple, her bags packed, stood in the grand hall, the Langley portraits watching as she prepared to depart. Beatrice clasped her hands, her voice thick with emotion. "Jane, you've woven us back together. This house owes you everything." Miss Marple's smile was modest, her eyes twinkling. "I only followed the threads, Beatrice. The strength was always yours." As the car rolled down the gravel drive, Ravenbrook Hall receded into the mist, its towers softened by the promise of renewal. Miss Marple gazed out the window, her thoughts on the fragile hearts she'd helped mend. Victor's betrayal, Clara's doubts, Roger's debts, Pritchard's misstep, Lavinia's shame. Each was a thread in the human tapestry, flawed but redeemable. "People are so careless with their truths," she murmured, her knitting bag at her side. "But they find their way, given time." The train to St. Mary Mead awaited, its whistle a gentle call to new mysteries, new stories to unravel. Ravenbrook Hall stood tall, its wounds healing under the quiet light of truth. The sapphire's shadow had lifted, leaving room for hope to bloom. Chapter 10. A New Dawn. The morning mist had lifted from Ravenbrook Hall, revealing a Kent countryside bathed in the gentle glow of an October sun. The estate's ivy-clad towers stood resolute, their ancient stones warmed by light that seemed to promise renewal. The shadow of Inspector Mallory's murder, though still etched in memory, was fading, softened by the truth Miss Jane Marple had so deftly uncovered. Victor Henshaw's arrest had closed the case, the Langley star sapphire was secured in its vault, and the household was beginning to weave itself back together. Miss Marple, her tweed coat neatly buttoned, stood in the grand hall, her knitting bag at her side, ready to depart for St. Mary Mead. Yet the air held a quiet anticipation, as if Ravenbrook awaited one final stitch to complete its mending. Lady Beatrice Langley, her burgundy gown replaced by a simpler dress, joined Miss Marple, her face softened by gratitude but lined with the weight of recent days. "Jane," she said, her voice warm but steady, "you've given us more than justice. You've given us hope." Miss Marple's smile was modest, her bird-like eyes twinkling. "Hope, Beatrice, is what remains when truth clears the shadows. You've always had it in you." The hall, with its polished marble and stern Langley portraits, felt less imposing now, as if the estate itself exhaled in relief. The other guests, Captain Roger Langley, Miss Clara Worthing, Dr. Ernest Pritchard, and Mrs. Lavinia Gray, were scattered about, each finding their own path forward. Roger and Clara, their engagement tested by mistrust, had emerged stronger, their bond tempered by honest promises. Pritchard, his reserve giving way to quiet purpose, had become a steady presence for the staff. Lavinia, her sharp edges smoothed, was channeling her energy into new ventures. The constable, Harris, had departed with the final evidence for Victor's trial, leaving the household to its healing. Miss Marple, ever observant, knew her role now was to ensure these fragile threads held firm. She began with a walk through the rose garden where Clara sat sketching, her auburn hair catching the sunlight. The young heiress looked up, her eyes brighter than they'd been. "Miss Marple," she said, setting her pencil down, "Roger and I are planning a quieter life, perhaps away from London's gossip. He's selling his commission to settle his debts." Miss Marple settled beside her, her voice gentle. "A wise choice, my dear. A simple life weaves the strongest bonds." Clara's smile was tentative but genuine. "I was afraid to trust again, but you showed me it's possible." Miss Marple patted her hand, sensing a resilience that would carry Clara far. Roger found polishing his boots in the stables, a task that seemed to ground him, offered a sheepish grin. "Miss Marple, I've made a mess of things, haven't I?" His voice was lighter, his military stiffness eased. but Clara's agreed to give me a chance, and I've wired my solicitor to liquidate what I can. No more gambling." Miss Marple's needles, though idle, seemed to hum with approval. "Captain Langley, a man who faces his faults is a man who can stand tall. You and Clara will find your way." Roger's nod was firm, his eyes holding a spark of determination she trusted would endure. Dr. Pritchard, encountered in the village square where he was arranging medical supplies for a free clinic, greeted Miss Marple with a rare warmth. "Your clarity saved us from ourselves, Miss Marple," he said, adjusting his spectacles. "I thought to protect Clara with a lie, but truth was kinder." Miss Marple's smile was encouraging. "Kindness, doctor, lies in honesty, not concealment. Your work here will do much good." Pritchard's expression softened, and he mentioned plans to expand his clinic, a quiet redemption for his earlier misstep. Lavinia Gray, in her greenhouse, was pruning her orchids with a newfound calm. The petal that had briefly implicated her was a distant memory, but her burned papers had laid bare her financial ruin. "Jane," she said, her voice free of its usual sharpness, "I've sold some heirlooms to settle my debts. I'm starting a floral business, small but mine." Miss Marple examined a vibrant bloom, her voice soft. "You've turned shame into strength, Mrs. Gray. That's no small feat." Lavinia's eyes glistened, and she offered Miss Marple a cutting of her favorite orchid. "For St. Mary Mead," she said, a rare gesture of warmth. Beatrice, over a final tea in the morning room, outlined her vision for Ravenbrook. "The sapphire stays locked away," she said firmly, her eyes resolute. "I'm hosting a charity event in Mallory's name to support the village school. It's time this house gave back." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her gaze warm. "A noble plan, Beatrice. You've always known how to lead." Beatrice's smile was steady, a promise to restore the estate's honor without the weight of its treasures. A final discovery came from Mr. Grayson, the butler, who approached Miss Marple with a small packet found in the library's desk, overlooked in the chaos. It was a letter from Mallory, written days before his death, addressed to Beatrice. "I fear I've stirred old wounds," it read. "Victor's errors are grave, but his heart was once true. Forgive him if you can." Miss Marple handed it to Beatrice, who read it silently, her eyes misting. "He was a good man," she said softly. "I'll honor his wish in my way." The letter, a final thread of Mallory's compassion, softened the sting of Victor's betrayal. The household, under Grayson's steady guidance, was returning to its rhythm. The staff, once shaken, moved with purpose, preparing for Beatrice's charity event. Clara and Roger, seen planning a modest wedding, spoke of a cottage in the countryside, free of society's glare. Pritchard's clinic drew villagers, easing the estate's strained ties with the community. Lavinia's greenhouse buzzed with orders, her floral venture a small but promising start. Beatrice, ever the matriarch, coordinated with the vicar, her strength a beacon for Ravenbrook's future. Miss Marple, her bags waiting by the grand hall's doors, took a final walk through the estate. The portraits of stern Langleys seemed to watch with approval, their gaze softened by the light of renewal. Beatrice joined her, clasping her hands. "Jane, you've woven us back together," she said, her voice thick. "This house will never forget you." Miss Marple's smile was modest, her eyes twinkling. "I only followed the threads, Beatrice. The heart of Ravenbrook was always strong." As the car rolled down the gravel drive, Miss Marple gazed at the receding towers, her thoughts on the lives she'd touched. Victor's fall, Clara's courage, Roger's redemption, Pritchard's goodwill, Lavinia's resolve, Beatrice's leadership. Each was a stitch in the human tapestry, flawed but enduring. "People are so careless with their hopes," she murmured, her knitting bag at her side. "But they bloom, given light." The train to St. Mary Mead whistled in the distance, calling her to new mysteries, new stories to weave. Ravenbrook Hall stood tall, its wounds healed by truth and time. A new dawn had broken, and the estate, like its people, was ready to face the future.